Emily Parker had always been a bit of a workaholic. At 28, she had recently moved to Chicago for a new job in marketing, leaving behind her small-town roots and the familiar faces of her childhood. While her professional life was thriving, her personal life had taken a back seat. Between the long hours and the pressures of climbing the corporate ladder, Emily hadn't made much time for relationships or friendships. She'd heard of people meeting their partners through friends or work, but in a big city like Chicago, that wasn't always easy. The idea of stepping into the dating scene felt daunting, and the thought of approaching someone in a bar or at a coffee shop seemed even more intimidating. That's when a friend of hers suggested she try online dating. "Everyone's doing it these days," her friend had said. "You can meet people without all the awkwardness of face-to-face interactions." Emily wasn't entirely convinced, but curiosity got the better of her. She'd seen enough online dating success stories, couples who'd met, fallen in love, and eventually gotten married. With a bit of hesitation, Emily signed up for one of the most popular dating apps in the country. Her profile was simple and genuine, nothing too flashy, just a snapshot of who she was, an adventurous spirit with a love for travel, photography, and good coffee. She carefully selected her pictures, making sure they represented her in a way that felt authentic. She didn't want to mislead anyone, nor did she expect too much. Emily wasn't looking for anything serious, just maybe someone to share a few laughs with, maybe grab a coffee once in a while. She was skeptical about finding love online, but the idea of meeting new people was appealing. Within the first few days, she began getting matches, but none of them really stood out. Most of the men she spoke with felt generic, their messages consisting of bland compliments and uninspired small talk. There were a few odd interactions too, strange comments about her appearance or unsolicited suggestions for dates that felt more like a sales pitch than an invitation. Emily was ready to delete the app when she got a message from a man named Jason. His profile was different. His pictures were natural, not overly staged or edited. He had a genuine smile in every photo, and his bio was thoughtful. He described himself as a graphic designer who loved the outdoors, a fan of art galleries and literature. His messages were well written, and he asked insightful questions, not just about her interests, but about her life. What had she studied in college? What inspired her to move to Chicago? She liked that he seemed interested in getting to know her, rather than just chatting for the sake of chatting. They exchanged messages for several days. Jason's texts were respectful and light-hearted, and Emily found herself looking forward to his responses. There was something comforting about his tone, something reassuring. He didn't rush things, and he didn't push for anything more than casual conversation. As they talked more, Emily began to feel like she'd found someone who genuinely shared her interests. She felt comfortable. After about a week of chatting, Jason suggested they meet in person. He recommended a quiet coffee shop in her neighborhood, one that was known for its cozy atmosphere. Emily agreed, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. It was their first real meeting, after all, though part of her hesitated. She'd heard all the horror stories about online dating. She told herself that she needed to take a leap. The prospect of meeting someone new, of perhaps forming a friendship or a connection, was something she couldn't ignore. She texted her best friend the details of their meeting, the time, the place, and Jason's full name. She was cautious, as anyone should be. She knew the importance of being careful when meeting someone for the first time, but she couldn't help but feel a flutter of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something good. At the back of her mind, she reminded herself to be careful, to trust her instincts. She never could have predicted how drastically her life would change after that first meeting. The day of their first meeting arrived with an unexpected sense of excitement. Emily had spent the morning carefully picking out an outfit that was casual but still put together, something that would make her feel confident but not overly dressed up. She wanted to appear approachable, comfortable, someone who could be herself. She looked in the mirror before leaving, double-checking that everything was in place. Despite her nerves, she reminded herself that it was just coffee, a casual, friendly meetup. There was no pressure. The coffee shop Jason had suggested was a charming little place in her neighborhood, tucked away on a quiet street. It was the kind of spot that had an old-world feel, with dark wood furniture, mismatched chairs, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee hanging in the air. The soft hum of indie music played in the background, and the baristas behind the counter moved with a quiet rhythm that made the space feel relaxed. Emily liked the place immediately. She arrived early and found a seat by the window where she could watch people come and go, occasionally checking her phone to see if Jason had messaged her. When Jason walked through the door, Emily recognized him immediately. He was exactly as he had appeared in his profile pictures. Tall, with tousled brown hair and a casual yet stylish sense of dress. He smiled when he saw her, and for a moment, she felt an instant sense of ease. His presence was calm, grounded, even charming in a way that made her feel as though they had known each other longer than they actually had. "Emily?" he asked, his voice low and pleasant. "Yes, that's me," she replied with a smile, standing to greet him. They shook hands, and there was something genuine about the way he looked at her, something warm in his eyes. He seemed just as relaxed as he had online, and as they sat down, the conversation flowed naturally. Jason was easy to talk to, asking questions about her life in Chicago, her work, and her interests. He listened attentively, nodding and making thoughtful comments. Emily found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected, sharing details about her childhood, her decision to move to the city, and even some of her personal challenges. Jason never interrupted, always letting her speak freely. They talked for what felt like hours, touching on everything from favorite books to the places they wanted to travel. His stories about his travels abroad were particularly interesting to her. He had been to places Emily had only dreamed of visiting. She was impressed by how well-read he seemed, and his taste in art aligned with hers in surprising ways. She had initially been nervous that they might not click in person, but she found herself more and more comfortable with each passing minute. At one point, Jason suggested they take a walk in the park nearby. The weather was perfect, mild with a cool breeze that made the sun feel just right. Emily agreed, thinking it would be nice to continue their conversation in a quieter setting. They left the coffee shop together, strolling down the tree-lined streets. As they walked, Jason became a little more animated, more excited about certain topics, like his love for nature and hiking. Emily enjoyed hearing his passion for the outdoors. It reminded her of her own childhood adventures in the woods near her hometown. But as the minutes passed, something began to feel a little off. It wasn't anything specific, just a subtle shift in the air. Jason's questions had started to feel a little too personal, probing into aspects of her life that Emily hadn't planned on sharing so early. He asked about her family, her past relationships, and even about things like her childhood fears and insecurities. It wasn't that his questions were inappropriate. He wasn't pushy, but there was a weight behind them that made Emily feel exposed. She told herself it was just nerves on his part, maybe an attempt to make their conversation more intimate. But her instincts were beginning to stir. They reached the edge of the park, and Jason suggested they walk along a more secluded path, one that cut through a dense cluster of trees. Emily hesitated, her sense of unease growing. She had always been cautious when meeting people, and her mind began running through all the what-ifs. Yet there was still a part of her that wanted to give Jason the benefit of the doubt. He hadn't given her any real reason to feel afraid, not yet. But as they ventured deeper into the park, something inside her told her to be on alert. Jason's movements were subtle but deliberate. He was leading the way, guiding her through the winding trails without much mention of where they were headed. The quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the park had started to feel oppressive, and the farther they walked, the more isolated they became from the rest of the world. The sound of their footsteps was the only noise in the air, and as the trees thickened around them, Emily felt a sense of growing tension. She tried to shake off her feelings, convinced it was just nerves, but deep down she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in Jason's demeanor. The way his words had begun to take on a different tone, more intense, more focused on her rather than on their shared interests. The moment she started to feel unsure, a small alarm bell went off in her mind. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't ignore it either. As they walked further into the park, Emily's unease began to crystallize into something more tangible. Jason, once warm and engaging, had grown quiet, and his steps had become heavier, more deliberate. The light-hearted tone they had shared over coffee seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a tense silence that Emily couldn't shake. Every now and then she would glance at him, but Jason's eyes were fixed ahead, his focus unwavering as though he had an end goal in mind. It was as though the carefree nature of their initial interaction had been replaced with something darker, something unfamiliar. The path they were walking on had become narrower, the trees pressing closer together, casting long shadows over the trail. Emily's pace slowed slightly as the woods thickened, the once calming chirps of birds now replaced with a still, almost suffocating quiet. The park had been relatively empty when they first arrived, but now it seemed even emptier, the occasional passerby a distant memory. The only sounds that seemed to fill the space were the distant hum of traffic and their own footsteps crunching along the gravel path. Jason hadn't noticed, or perhaps he didn't care. He kept leading the way, his pace steady but unyielding, never once asking if she was okay. Emily's mind raced. She tried to dismiss her growing discomfort, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. After all, they were just walking in the park, but something didn't feel right. The way Jason had led her here, away from the main path and deeper into the trees, felt deliberate. Why hadn't he mentioned this detour earlier? Why hadn't he asked if she was comfortable walking into a more isolated area? When Emily paused for a moment, taking a breath and glancing around, Jason noticed. He turned to face her with a soft, almost encouraging smile, but his eyes, those eyes that had once seemed so warm, now felt cold, calculating. "Sir, we're not for harvesters. Never too soon, sir. I'm training him to kill." "Never too soon, sir. I'm training him to kill." "Yeah," she replied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Just a bit out of breath. Maybe we should head back?" Jason didn't answer right away. He seemed to study her for a moment, his gaze lingering too long, as though he were measuring something. Emily took an involuntary step backward, her instinct screaming at her to get out of there. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt the weight of the situation shift. This wasn't just a casual walk anymore. This wasn't the man she'd been chatting with online for weeks. The person standing in front of her now was different. A stranger. But before she could make any move to leave, Jason spoke again. "We're almost there," he said, his tone low and almost coaxing, as if to reassure her. "Just a little farther. I promise it'll be worth it." Something about his words sent a jolt through her. She wasn't sure what it was, but she had no desire to find out. Every fiber of her being told her to leave now. "Jason," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think it's getting late. Maybe we should just go back to the coffee shop." Jason's expression flickered, a subtle shift in his demeanor that wasn't immediately apparent but left her feeling uneasy. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. "Just a few more minutes," he said, his voice tightening just enough to make Emily's heart skip. It wasn't the suggestion that unsettled her. It was the way he said it, like he was trying to control the situation, to make her comply. The moment the words left his mouth, Emily's pulse quickened. She took another step back, her feet crunching loudly on the gravel. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. What if he chased her? What if he was stronger than she anticipated? Jason's eyes flickered to her retreating movement, and for a brief second she saw something dark behind them, something that made her stomach churn. She had made a mistake. She had trusted him, and now that trust felt like a dangerous gamble. Just as she began to turn, his hand shot out with surprising speed. He grabbed her wrist with a force that made her gasp, pulling her back toward him. The grip was unyielding like a vice, and she felt a rush of panic flood her chest. "Don't," she heard herself whisper, though the word barely escaped her lips. "Let's go," he murmured, his voice low, almost soothing, but there was nothing comforting about the way he spoke. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to free herself, her fingers digging into his arm in a desperate attempt to pry his hand away. But it was no use. His grip tightened. In that moment, everything that had seemed normal before, the coffee, the conversation, the easy connection, faded away. Emily saw Jason for what he truly was, not the man she had been chatting with online, not the person she had trusted, but someone entirely different. Panic surged through her, and in a last-ditch effort to escape, she kicked out with all the strength she had, striking him in the shin. Jason let out a sharp grunt of pain, his grip loosening for a moment. That was all Emily needed. She twisted her arm free and took off running, her feet pounding the gravel as she bolted down the path. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't afford to. Emily ran as fast as her legs would carry her, her heart thundering in her chest. The sounds of her own frantic footsteps echoed through the park, mingling with the pounding rush of adrenaline that was flooding her system. She didn't look back. She couldn't. All she could focus on was putting as much distance as possible between herself and Jason. Every instinct told her that if she stopped or hesitated for even a second, she might never get the chance to escape. Her mind raced with panic as she sprinted along the gravel path, weaving around trees and underbrush, trying to find the familiar sight of the main park exit. She was disoriented now, her surroundings blurred in her peripheral vision, a haze of motion and fear. She had been so focused on the interaction with Jason that she hadn't noticed how deep into the park they had gone. The winding trail seemed endless, and her breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. Behind her, the silence of the park had been broken by the sound of Jason's voice, low but carrying through the stillness. "Emily," he called, and though his tone was casual, almost mocking, it sent a chill through her veins. His voice wasn't the same as it had been back at the coffee shop, or even when they'd first walked into the park. There was no warmth in it now, only a coldness that made her blood run cold. She didn't dare slow down. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to keep moving, to get to safety, but the park felt empty, too quiet, and the streets beyond still seemed far away. She couldn't hear any other voices, no other footsteps, nothing that would tell her someone else was nearby. She was alone. And every instinct told her that this isolation was exactly what Jason had wanted. She stumbled slightly, catching herself on a nearby tree as she tried to regain her balance. The sheer force of her fear made her legs feel like they were made of lead. She was beginning to tire, her breath becoming more labored with every step. There was no way she could keep up this pace much longer, and she knew it. If Jason caught up to her, she didn't know what he would do, but she had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be good. With every passing second, Emily's fear intensified. It was as though the park itself had conspired to swallow her up, the dense trees and thick underbrush closing in on her. She couldn't afford to keep running in circles, couldn't afford to lose her bearings. If she didn't make it out soon, she wouldn't make it out at all. Just as she was starting to feel the first flickers of hopelessness, she saw it. A glimpse of light through the trees, a break in the foliage where the path widened. She could see the distant outline of the park's exit sign. It was just ahead, but it felt impossibly far away. She pushed herself harder, her breath ragged in her chest as she sprinted toward it, her legs burning with exhaustion. A noise behind her made her pause for just a moment, a footstep, then a snap of a twig. She didn't turn around, but her blood went cold. Jason was getting closer. She could feel it. The exit was just a few yards away, but the last stretch of the path felt like an eternity. Her mind screamed for her to keep going, to not look back, to not let her fear make her falter. But just as she reached the end of the path, she heard something that stopped her dead in her tracks. A voice, low and calm, yet unmistakable. Emily. It was Jason, and he was right behind her. Before she could react, he was there. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm with terrifying force, yanking her back toward him. She gasped in shock, but her scream caught in her throat. His grip was ironclad. She kicked out with all her might, but he barely flinched. His face was inches from hers now, and there was no trace of the man she had spoken to just hours ago. His expression was cold, devoid of any emotion except for a quiet, unsettling satisfaction. Emily's heart was racing, her thoughts a blur. There was no escape. She was trapped. Her mind flashed back to the moment in the coffee shop, to the conversations they had shared, to the things she had told him. Every vulnerable detail, every moment of trust had led her to this moment. She had made a fatal mistake by letting her guard down. Jason didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, holding her firmly, his gaze steady and unreadable. She could feel the weight of his presence, the suffocating silence that hung in the air between them. Her breath came in short gasps, and she could feel her pulse in her throat. Then he spoke. "You shouldn't have run," he said softly, his voice almost like a whisper. But there was nothing kind about it. There was no comfort in his words, no understanding. Emily felt the cold grip of fear closing around her as she tried to break free, but it was no use. Jason's strength was too much. She had no choice now but to fight with everything she had left, to do whatever it took to survive. Her mind was running on pure instinct, her body fueled by the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would be close enough to hear her scream. But there was no one, just the dark, silent woods and the man who had been lying to her from the very beginning. In that moment, Emily realized the horrifying truth. This was not just a date. It was a trap, and she had walked right into it. The sirens of the police cars grew louder as Emily stood in the park entrance, her hands trembling from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had barely been able to speak after the jogger had called the authorities. Every part of her body was on high alert, her pulse racing as she watched the flashing lights draw nearer. For a moment, she thought she might collapse from the sheer weight of what had just happened. She felt dizzy, her legs unsteady and her breath still coming in sharp, shallow gasps. But she remained standing, knowing that she had to stay strong until the police arrived. The jogger, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, kept her distance, giving Emily space but not leaving her alone. She stood off to the side, her phone still in hand, nervously speaking with the dispatcher on the line. Emily could hear snippets of her conversation, the words muffled by the chaos swirling in her mind. "Yes, she's shaken, but she's safe now. He ran off, but we saw him. He was definitely the guy." Emily couldn't focus on the conversation. She kept replaying the events in her head. The moment Jason had grabbed her, the raw terror in his eyes, the feeling of being trapped, the struggle to get away. It all felt surreal, like it had happened to someone else, yet her body still carried the echoes of the terror. The ache in her wrists from where his fingers had dug into her skin, the tension in her shoulders from the fight or flight instinct that had taken over her entire being. The fear hadn't gone away. It was still there, gnawing at the edges of her mind, reminding her that she had narrowly escaped something far darker than she had ever imagined. When the police arrived, Emily had never been so relieved to see strangers in uniform. They rushed toward her, immediately taking control of the situation. One officer asked Sarah a few quick questions, while another approached Emily, his demeanor calm but firm. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily nodded, though her mouth felt dry, and she struggled to find her voice. The officer seemed to sense her distress and nodded reassuringly. "We're going to get this sorted out. Can you tell us what happened?" For the next few minutes, Emily recounted everything she could remember. Her voice wavered, and her words came out in a rush. She told them about meeting Jason on the dating app, their initial conversations, the coffee shop, and then the walk in the park. She explained how he had become more distant, how he had led her deeper into the woods, and how his demeanor had shifted from warm to menacing. She told them about the struggle, the panic, the way she had kicked him in a desperate attempt to break free. The officer listened intently, nodding occasionally. He made notes on his notepad, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't interrupt her story. When she finished, he asked her some more specific questions about Jason's appearance, the clothing he was wearing, and the park's layout. Emily did her best to describe him, though her memory felt clouded by the fear that had overwhelmed her. She could still picture his face clearly, but other details, like what he was wearing, escaped her. She hadn't been able to focus on anything but getting away. The officers assured her that they would look for Jason and begin their search right away. They also told her they would review any nearby security footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of him before he managed to flee the area. "Don't worry," the officer said. "We're going to do everything we can to track him down." Despite their assurances, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of dread that still clung to her. Jason had disappeared into the shadows, but she knew it wasn't over. He was still out there, and she wasn't sure when or if he would come back. After the police finished gathering all the details they needed, they offered Emily a ride to the station, but she declined. She felt safer with them around, but the thought of being alone in a small room with nothing but her thoughts was overwhelming. Instead, she called Lisa, who immediately agreed to meet her at the park and drive her home.